Richmond, Virginia, August 1855. In the suffocating heat of a Tuesday afternoon on the auction platform at Lumpkins Alley, something occurred that would fracture the carefully maintained order of Virginia's most powerful families. A slave was brought to the block, a young man whose appearance so thoroughly violated every assumption about human bondage that bidding didn't just exceed expectations. It stopped entirely for 17 full minutes while grown men stood paralyzed, unable to form words, unable to process what they were witnessing. Clear as throat, the price that finally broke the silence would reach $11,000, more than the cost of the entire auction house, more than some plantations sold for. The buyer, a man named Harrison Witmore, would be dead within 3 weeks. His widow would vanish before his body was cold. And the beautiful slave who caused this catastrophe would trigger a sequence of events so disturbing that Richmond's newspapers would later conspire to erase entire days from their archives, creating gaps in history that remain unexplained to this hour. What was it about this particular slave that drove rational men to madness? What secrets surrounded his arrival in Richmond that powerful institutions spent decades trying to bury? Before we dive deeper into what became known among those who remember as the Richmond Horror, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. What you're about to hear has been deliberately hidden from history textbooks, and we need your help making sure these buried truths finally see light. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We're building a community of people who refuse to let uncomfortable history stay buried. The truth begins not on the auction block, but 6 weeks earlier in the mountains of western Virginia, where something happened that no one could explain. The town of Lexington sits in the Shenandoah Valley, a place where old Virginia money goes to pretend the modern world doesn't exist. In July 1855, a traveling slave trader named Gideon Hale arrived there with a coff of 12 slaves he'd purchased from failing farms in Kentucky. Hale was known for his cruelty, even among men who made their living in human suffering. He worked alone, trusted no partners, and had a reputation for acquiring slaves through methods that other traders considered too dangerous or too immoral, even by their degraded standards. Hale checked into a boarding house on the edge of town, chained his slaves in the stable, and proceeded to drink himself into a stupor at the local tavern. This was his pattern: buy low in Kentucky, sell high in Richmond, drink away the guilt in between. But that night something changed. A woman appeared at the tavern. No one could later agree on her description. Some remembered her as elderly, others as middle-aged. Some said she wore black silk, others claimed simple homespun. But everyone remembered her eyes, gray eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the corruption beneath. She sat down across from Gideon Hale and spoke to him for less than 5 minutes. No one heard what was said. But when she left, Hale sat motionless for nearly an hour, sweat pouring down his face despite the evening cool, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't lift his glass. He stumbled back to his boarding house after midnight. The next morning, the stable where he'd chained his coffle stood empty. All 12 slaves had vanished. Their chains lay on the ground, still locked. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of how they'd escaped. And Gideon Hale was found in his room, conscious but unresponsive, his eyes open but seeing nothing, saliva running down his chin. The town doctor examined him and declared him the victim of some kind of apoplectic fit. His mind was gone. Whatever had happened to him had burned out his ability to speak, to reason, to function as anything more than a breathing body. He was taken to an asylum in Stanton, where he would spend the remaining 4 years of his life sitting in a chair, staring at nothing, occasionally whimpering like a beaten dog. The escaped slaves were never found. The mystery of how they'd freed themselves from locked chains in a secured stable remained unsolved, and most people in Lexington were content to forget the entire disturbing incident. Most people, but not everyone. 3 weeks after Hale's collapse, a slave appeared at the Richmond auction house of Pulliam and Slade. He arrived alone, walking through the front door at mid-morning, his wrists bound by simple rope. No chains, no handler, no documentation of ownership. James Pulliam, the senior partner, later described the moment of his arrival as the strangest experience of his 40-year career in the slave trade. The young man was perhaps 23 years old, tall and lean, with skin that held a color somewhere between honey and amber, suggesting mixed ancestry, though not in the usual patterns. His features possessed a symmetry that seemed mathematically impossible. High cheekbones, hat caught light like sculpture, a jawline that could have been rendered by a master portraitist, eyes of such an unusual color, a deep violet blue that appeared almost luminous in certain light, that Pium actually stepped backward when the young man looked directly at him. But it wasn't just the physical beauty, though that alone was extraordinary enough to draw attention. It was something else, and quality of stillness about him, a sense that he existed somehow outside the normal flow of time and circumstance. He moved with a grace that suggested noble breeding. Yet his clothes were simple laborer's garments, worn but clean. He spoke when spoken to, his voice cultured and precise. Yet he offered no explanation for his presence, no story of where he'd come from or who owned him. "Who sent you here?" Pium demanded, trying to reassert authority over this deeply unsettling situation. "I was told you would know what to do with me," the young man replied calmly. "Told by whom?" "By the woman in gray." Pulliam felt ice travel down his spine. He'd heard rumors from Lexington. Travelers passing through Richmond had spoken of the strange incident with Gideon Hale and the vanished slaves, the woman no one could clearly describe, and now this beautiful creature stood in his auction house claiming she'd sent him. "What's your name?" Pulliam asked, his voice barely steady. "My name is Josiah. Do you have papers, documentation of ownership, a bill of sale?" Josiah smiled, and the expression carried such sadness that Pium felt ashamed without understanding why. "No papers, no ownership, nothing but what you see before you. Then you're a runaway. I should hand you over to the authorities. You could do that, but you won't, because you've already calculated my value, Mr. Pium. You've already imagined the price I would bring at auction, and you've already decided that profit outweighs legality." The accuracy of this assessment struck Pium like a physical blow. It was exactly what he'd been thinking. A slave of such extraordinary appearance, offered without documentation or traceable ownership, represented an opportunity unlike anything he'd encountered. If he simply entered Josiah into his next auction with manufactured paperwork, who would question it? Who would look past that face and body to ask uncomfortable questions about providence and legality? "Where would you even go if I released you?" Pium asked, more to himself than to Josiah. "A slave without papers is as good as court. You'd be recaptured within a day." "Then it seems we both understand the situation. You profit, I receive food and shelter, and we avoid involving authorities who might ask questions neither of us want to answer." And so Pulliam made his devil's bargain. He created false documentation claiming Josiah had been sold to him by a Kentucky farmer, forged a bill of sale with a practiced hand, and entered him into the upcoming auction scheduled for August 14th. He told his business partner, Samuel Slade, only that he'd acquired an exceptional piece of property that would bring unprecedented prices. He told no one about the mysterious circumstances of Josiah's arrival, or the deeply unsettling conversation they'd shared. But word spread anyway. Word always spreads in Richmond when something extraordinary appears. Within days, whispers circulated through the city's elite circles. "A slave of impossible Thank you, a young man who looked like something from mythology rather than mundane reality. A once-in-a-lifetime acquisition for whoever had the means and the will to possess him." The Witmore family heard these whispers at exactly the wrong moment in their declining fortunes. Harrison Witmore had inherited his father's tobacco plantation 5 years earlier with grand ambitions of expansion and modernization. Instead, he'd presided over steady decline, poor crop yields, bad investments in railroad stock, mounting debts to Richmond banks. His wife Catherine came from old Virginia money, but her family's wealth was tied up in land and reputation rather than liquid capital. The Witmores maintained appearances through increasingly desperate measures, hosting lavish parties they couldn't afford, purchasing luxuries on credit, always one step ahead of creditors. Harrison's younger brother, Thomas, watched this decline with growing alarm. Thomas had none of Harrison's grand ambitions or Catherine's social pretensions. He managed the plantation's daily operations while his brother played gentleman farmer in Richmond. He understood exactly how close they were to complete financial collapse, and he'd been arguing for months that they needed to sell assets, reduce expenses, admit their limitations before disaster became unavoidable. But Harrison wouldn't listen. Harrison believed in appearances, in the power of reputation to overcome material reality. And when he heard about the extraordinary slave being offered at Pulliam and Slade, he saw opportunity rather than risk. A slave of such remarkable appearance would be the ultimate status symbol, proof that the Witmore family still commanded resources, still deserved their place among Virginia's elite. The price didn't matter. The cost would be justified by the social advantage he would gain. Thomas tried to reason with him. They didn't have $11,000 to spend on a single slave. They barely had $11,000, period. But Harrison dismissed these concerns. He would find the money. He would borrow from the banks using the plantation as collateral. He would win the auction and restore the Witmore name to prominence through sheer audacity. Catherine, for her part, had her own reasons for supporting the purchase. She'd heard different rumors about Josiah, whispers among the women of Richmond society about the slave's unusual qualities, how he seemed to understand things before they were spoken, how his presence in a room changed the atmosphere, made people confess truths they'd intended to keep hidden. Catherine had secrets of her own, secrets that threatened everything she'd built. And she believed with the magical thinking of desperate people that possessing this extraordinary slave might somehow protect her from exposure. The other major interest came from the Preston family. Senator Marcus Preston represented Virginia and Washington, a position of enormous power and influence. His son, Daniel, managed the family's Richmond holdings, including a townhouse on Grace Street, where the senator stayed during his frequent returns from the capital. Daniel had recently married a Philadelphia eyes named Elizabeth, bringing much-needed capital into the Preston family coffers, but the marriage was troubled. Elizabeth found Virginia society stifling and backward. She hated the slavery that surrounded her, made no secret of her ability, honest sympathies, and had already threatened to return to Philadelphia and take her fortune with her. Daniel, desperate to salvage his marriage and maintain access to Elizabeth's money, thought the beautiful slave might serve as a peace offering, something so rare and valuable that even Elizabeth's moral objections might be overcome by the aesthetic appeal. He imagined presenting Josiah as essentially a work of art, rather than a laborer, a household ornament that would demonstrate the Preston family's refined taste, rather than their participation in human bondage. It was twisted logic born of desperation, but Daniel believed it absolutely. As August 14th approached, James Pulliam realized he'd created something far more dangerous than a simple high-value auction. The interest in Josiah had taken on an obsessive quality. Multiple wealthy families had made private inquiries, offers of advanced purchase at premium prices, thinly veiled threats about what might happen if they didn't win the bidding. The situation had escalated beyond normal commercial competition into something darker, something that felt like violence, waiting for an excuse to manifest. Pulliam tried to manage the situation by establishing strict auction rules. Each bidder would be required to show proof of funds before participating. Bidding would be conducted in a private room rather than the public block. Only serious buyers with verified resources would be admitted. But these precautions, intended to prevent chaos, would prove entirely inadequate for what was coming. The night before the auction, Josiah requested to speak with PM privately. The auction house owner found him in the holding room sitting a simple cot, his hands folded calmly in his lap. In the lamplight, his beauty seemed even more pronounced, almost painful to witness directly. "You know what's going to happen tomorrow," Josiah said quietly. "Not a question, a statement." "I know there will be substantial bidding," PM replied carefully. "I expect to see a final price that will satisfy all parties. That's not what I mean. You know there will be violence. You felt it building. Men don't spend $11,000 on a slave without rage and desperation driving them. Whatever happens tomorrow will destroy someone, probably multiple people, and you'll bear responsibility for facilitating it." PM felt anger rise in him. "I'm conducting legitimate business. If wealthy men want to compete for valuable property, that's their affair. I didn't create the circumstances that brought you here, didn't you?" Josiah's violet eyes fixed on him with unsettling intensity. "You chose to proceed without questioning where I came from. You chose to forge documentation rather than investigate my origins. You chose profit over conscience, Mr. Pulliam, and tomorrow you'll see where that choice leads." "What are you?" PM whispered, voicing the question that had haunted him for weeks. "You're not like other slaves. You're not like anyone I've ever encountered. What really happened in Lexington with Gideon Hale? Who is the woman in gray? Josiah smiled, that sad smile again. Some questions answer themselves, Mr. Pulliam. Pay attention tomorrow. Watch what happens when men try to possess what was never meant to be owned. You'll understand everything then. The conversation left Pulliam deeply shaken. He returned to his office and spent hours reviewing the forged documentation he'd created, searching for some flaw that might provide excuse to cancel the auction. But the papers were perfect. He'd been too skilled at his forgery, and more practically canceling now would enrage the wealthy families who'd already committed to bidding. He was trapped by his own greed into seeing this through to whatever conclusion awaited. August 14th arrived with oppressive heat and air so thick it felt like breathing water. The auction was scheduled for 2. By noon, the Witmore, Preston, and 3 other wealthy families had assembled at Pulliam and Slade, each accompanied by lawyers and financial agents, each determined to win regardless of cost. Harrison Witmore arrived with documents showing he'd mortgaged his entire plantation, every acre, every building, every slave he currently owned, all offered as collateral for a loan that would give the liquid capital to bid without limit. Thomas had refused to attend, making his disgust with this insanity clear. But Catherine accompanied her husband, dressed in her finest silk, ready to witness their family's salvation or destruction. Daniel Preston brought bank drafts worth $15,000, the maximum he'd been able to extract from Elizabeth's trust without her direct authorization. She didn't know he was here. She didn't know he was about to spend her inheritance on a human being. He planned to present Josiah to her as an accomplished fact, believing she would accept it once confronted with the reality. The other bidders represented various degrees of wealth and desperation, a cotton factor named Williams, who saw Josiah as an investment that could be resold to northern collectors for even higher prices, a widow named Mrs. Ashford, whose interest seemed to go beyond commercial considerations into territory that made even the other bidders uncomfortable, and a quiet man named Graves, who offered no explanation for his presence, but whose eyes held a cold calculation that suggested purposes no one wanted to examine too closely. At exactly 2, Josiah was brought into the private auction room, and for 17 full minutes, no one spoke, no one moved. They simply stared at him with expressions ranging from awe to hunger to something approaching fear. The reality of his presence exceeded every description they'd heard. He stood on the raised platform in simple clothing, his hands unbound now, his posture relaxed but dignified, and he looked at each bidder in turn with those violent eyes that seemed to see through flesh to the desperations and corruptions beneath. James Pulliam finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "Gentlemen, ladies, we'll begin bidding at $1,000. $5,000, Harrison Witmore said immediately, his voice tight with need. $7,000, Daniel Preston counted without hesitation. $9,000, Mrs. Ashford said, her eyes never leaving Josiah's face. The bidding escalated with terrifying speed. $10,000, $11,000, $12,000. The amounts being thrown out exceeded rational assessment of value. This was no longer commerce. This was something else, something dark and consuming. $15,000, the quiet man named Graves said calmly. Final offer. The room went silent. $15,000 for a single slave. The amount was obscene. It exceeded the combined annual income of most Virginia families. For a brief moment it seemed the auction would end with Graves as the winner. But Harry, son Witmore, wasn't done. His face had gone red, sweat pouring down his temples, his hands shaking. He looked at Catherine, who nodded almost imperceptibly, giving permission for the family's complete destruction. And Harrison said in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere beyond rational thought, $20,000. The shock in the room was absolute. James Pulliam actually gasped. Daniel Preston made a sound like he'd been struck. Even Josiah, who'd maintained perfect composure, showed the faintest flicker of what might have been pity. Going once, Pulliam said mechanically. Going twice. Sold, Graves said quietly from the back of the room. But not to Mr. Witmore. Sold to death and misery and consequences none of you are prepared to face. What are you talking about? Pull demanded. You're not the high bidder. I'm not bidding at all, Mr. Pulliam. I'm simply observing. And what I observe is that this young man was correct. Watch what happens when men try to possess what was never meant to be owned. The lesson is about to begin. And with that cryptic statement, Graves walked out of the auction room, leaving behind a group of people who'd just witnessed something that made no sense. A bidder who'd bid $15,000, only to walk away when beaten. A stranger who'd spoken like he knew secrets about Josiah that no one else understood. An atmosphere of wrongness so thick it was almost visible, but the auction was complete. Harrison Witmore had won with his insane bid of $20,000. The paperwork was signed with shaking hands. The money transferred through bank drafts that would take weeks to fully clear, but were accepted on the Witmore family's name and collateral. And Josiah became, at least, on paper, the legal property of a man who just destroyed himself to possess him. What Harrison Witmore didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that the auction was not the end of this story. It was barely the beginning, and the terrible education Graves had mentioned was about to commence in ways that would haunt Richmond for decades. Harrison Witmore brought Josiah to the family estate that same evening, riding in a closed carriage, as if transporting something too precious or too dangerous to expose to public view. The plantation house stood 7 miles outside Richmond, a columned mansion that had represented Witmore prosperity for 3 generations. Now it represented debt so massive that $20,000 added to existing obligations meant the family owed more than the entire property was worth. Thomas was waiting on the front portico when they arrived. He'd heard about the auction results from a messenger who'd ridden ahead. His face held an expression beyond anger, beyond disgust, something closer to grief. "You destroyed us," Thomas said flatly, as Harrison helped Josiah down from the carriage. "For a pretty face, you traded away 3 generations of family legacy. I hope you're satisfied. You'll understand when you see him properly," Harrison replied, his voice carrying a manic edge. "When society sees what we've acquired, when they realize the Witters can still command resources that others can only dream of, society will realize we're bankrupt madmen," Thomas interrupted. "That's what they'll realize. We can't make the loan payments, Harrison. Even with perfect crop yields, we couldn't service the debt you just incurred. You've condemned us to foreclosure." Theron stepped between them, her expression carefully composed. "What's done is done. Fighting about it won't change anything. We'll adapt. We'll find a way forward." But as she spoke, her eyes kept drifting to Josiah, who stood quietly observing this family drama with that unsettling calm. And for just a moment, Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like ice water spreading through her veins, a certainty that bringing this beautiful creature into their home had invited something far worse than financial ruin. Josiah was given a room in the main house, not in the slave quarters. Harrison insisted on it, claiming he wanted his investment close and secure. But the decision created immediate tension among the estate's other slaves. Who was this newcomer that he warranted treatment reserved for family? What made him so special that normal rules didn't apply? The head house slave, an older woman named Ruth, who'd served the Witmore for 40 years, confronted Thomas about it that night. "That boy ain't natural," she said bluntly. "I seen him for just a minute when they brought him in, and I'm telling you, Mr. Thomas, there's something wrong about him. The way he looks at people, like he can see right through to your soul and find every sin you've tried to hide. He's just a slave, Ruth, an expensive one, but still just property. No, sir, he ain't just anything. You mark my words. That boy is going to bring death to this house. I feel it in my bones. Death and revelation and judgment." Thomas wanted to dismiss Ruth's concerns as superstition, but he'd felt it too when he looked at Josiah, that sense of wrongness of something operating according to rules that had nothing to do with the normal order of things. He'd spent his entire life on this plantation, had been raised among slaves, had managed human property as casually as managing livestock, but Josiah made him deeply uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. That first night, strange things began happening. Small things at first. A mirror in the hallway that cracked from corner to corner despite no impact or temperature change. 3 clocks in different rooms that all stopped at the same moment. 3:17 a.m., a portrait of Harrison's father that fell from its mounting and landed face down, the canvas torn as if by claws, though no animal had been near it. Harrison dismissed these incidents as coincidence. Old houses settled, objects fell. Clock stopped. Nothing about it warranted concern. But Catherine knew better. She'd grown up in a Virginia family that still remembered old stories, tales of hints and conjuring, and things that walked wearing human shapes, but carrying purposes that had nothing to do with human concerns. She tried to speak with Josiah the next morning, finding him in the garden, where he'd been given permission to walk. He stood among the roses, touching their petals with long fingers, his expression meditative. "Who are you really?" Catherine asked without preamble. "And don't tell me you're just a slave. I've seen slaves my entire life. You're something else." Josiah turned to her with those violet eyes, and Catherine felt her breath catch. "What do you want me to be, Mrs. Witmore? A victim you can pity? A possession you can display? A judgment you can fear? I want the truth. The truth is, you already know. You've known since the moment you agreed to let Harrison purchase me. You understood this would end badly, but you let it happen anyway because you thought maybe, just maybe, my presence would distract from your own secrets, that people would be so focused on the mysterious, beautiful slave that they wouldn't notice what you've been hiding." Catherine's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "The letters, Mrs. Witmore, the ones you've been burning in your bedroom fireplace, the correspondence with a certain gentleman in Charleston. Your husband thinks you burn old receipts and meaningless papers. He doesn't realize you've been conducting an affair for the past 2 years. An affair that's produced consequences you're desperately trying to conceal." Catherine stepped backward as if struck. "How could you possibly? I know many things. That's my purpose. Not to be owned, but to reveal, to bring hidden truths into light. Your husband destroyed himself financially to possess me. But what he actually purchased was exposure for himself, for you, for everyone in this house who's been living behind carefully maintained lies. You're saying you're here to destroy us deliberately. I'm saying I'm here because your family needed destroying. You've built everything on foundations of theft and violence and lies. The enslaved people who work this plantation. Do you know how they were acquired? Your husband's father bought most of them from a trader who specialized in kidnapping free black people from northern cities. 27 of the 32 slaves on this property were born free, stolen from their families, falsely documented, sold into bondage that has no legal legitimacy. That's not possible. My father-in-law was a respectable man. Respectability. Why and monstrosity aren't mutually exclusive, Mrs. Witmore. Many of history's greatest evils have been committed by respectable people who convinced themselves their actions were justified. Your family's respectability is built on bones, and now those bones are going to speak." Catherine fled from the garden, her heart hammering. She found Harrison in his study already drinking, though it was barely noon. She tried to tell him what Josiah had said, but her husband dismissed it as the slave trying to manipulate her emotions. "He's property, Catherine. Property doesn't make threats or predictions. It serves, and he'll serve us beautifully once society sees what we've acquired." But society was already seeing. Word of the $20,000 purchase had spread through Richmond like fire through dry grass. And the reaction was not admiration, but horror and mockery. Cartoons appeared in newspapers showing Harrison as a fool. Editorials questioned his sanity. Business associates who'd once courted Witmore favor now avoided the family entirely. The acquisition that was supposed to restore their reputation was destroying it far more effectively than bankruptcy alone could have managed. 3 days after Josiah's arrival, the first death occurred. One of the field slaves, a young man named Isaac, was found in his cabin with his throat cut. The wound was clean and deep, suggesting a sharp blade and someone who knew what they were doing. But Isaac's cabin door had been locked from the inside. The windows were too small for anyone to enter, and no weapon was found anywhere near the body. The local sheriff investigated perfunctorily. The death of a slave rarely warranted serious attention. He ruled it suicide, despite the impossibility of someone cutting their own throat so deeply and then making the knife vanish. The other slaves knew better. They whispered that Isaac had been talking about Josiah, had been saying things about the beautiful newcomer that suggested he knew something dangerous. Now Isaac was dead and the message was clear. Some secrets demanded silence. Thomas tried to convince Harrison to sell Josiah immediately, cut their losses, accept whatever price they could, remove this cursed presence from their home. But Harrison refused. He'd invested everything in this acquisition, Admitting it was a mistake would mean admitting he'd destroyed his family for nothing. His pride wouldn't allow that admission. Meanwhile, Daniel Preston was having his own crisis. He'd returned home after losing the auction to find his wife Elizabeth waiting with bank statements and trust documents spread across their dining table. She knew what he'd tried to do, knew he'd attempted to spend her inheritance on a slave without her permission. Her fury was incandescent. "You disgust me," she said, her voice shaking. "I knew you participated in this evil system. I knew you owned human beings, but I thought you at least had limits. I thought there was some line you wouldn't cross. Apparently I was wrong. It would have been a gift," Daniel stammered. "Something beautiful for our home. A gift would be freeing the slaves you already own. A gift would be using my money to help people escape bondage, rather than purchasing them deeper into it. This what you tried to do. This is just evil justified by aesthetic appreciation. You wanted to own a human being because he was beautiful, do yo? You understand how depraved that is. Everyone here owns slaves, Elizabeth. It's the foundation of our economy. Then your economy is built on hell, and I won't finance it another day. I'm leaving, Daniel. I'm returning to Philadelphia, and I'm taking every penny of my money with me. You can tell your family that their access to the Philadelphia capital is terminated permanently." She left that night taking documents that would effectively bankrupt the Preston family's Richmond operations. Daniel, desperate and humiliated, blamed Harrison Witmore for creating the auction that had exposed his moral bankruptcy to his wife. He blamed Josiah for being so valuable that he'd been willing to betray his own principles to acquire him, and he began planning revenge against both. But Daniel Preston wasn't the only person in Richmond planning violence. The quiet man from the auction, the one who'd called himself Graves, had not left the city. He'd taken rooms at a modest hotel and begun conducting his own investigation into Josiah's origins and purpose. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Graves was not his real name. He was actually Thomas Crawford, a former slave catcher who'd retired after witnessing something in Mississippi that had broken his faith in his profession. He'd seen a slave revolt put down with such savagery that even he, a man who'd made his living hunting human beings, couldn't stomach it. He'd walked away from the trade and spent the past 3 years trying to atone for his crimes through quiet work, helping runaways reach freedom in the North. But he'd heard about Josiah through his network of contacts, and something about the description had seemed familiar. Too fummy. Liar. He'd come to Richmond, not to purchase the slave, but to confirm a suspicion that had been gnawing at him for weeks. And the moment he saw Josiah in person, his suspicion was confirmed. 5 years earlier, Crawford had been hired to track a runaway slave in South Carolina, a young woman who'd escaped from a Charleston plantation. He'd found her after 3 weeks of searching, cornered her in a barn outside Columbia. But before he could restrain her, she'd turned to him with eyes that held a peculiar color, a deep violet blue that seemed to glow in the dim light, and she'd spoken to him. "You've destroyed families," she'd said calmly, "spirited mothers from children, returned human beings to torture and death. You've built your life on suffering. How do you sleep at night, Mr. Crawford? How do you live with what you've done?" Her words had struck him like physical blows. He tried to dismiss them as the desperate plea of a court runaway, but something in her voice, in her eyes, had pierced through his professional detachment to the conscience he'd thought long dead. He'd let her go that night, had falsified his report, claiming she drowned crossing a river, and he'd never taken another slave-catching job. Now he'd seen those same violet eyes in a young man at a Richmond auction. Different face, different gender, but unmistakably the same presence, the same unsettling quality of seeing through surface reality to the rot beneath. And Crawford understood that something far stranger than simple slave trading was occurring in Richmond. He began making quiet inquiries about the woman in gray, who'd appeared in Lexington before Gideon Hale's collapse, about other incidents across 5I, Virginia and the Carolas, where slave traders had suffered mysterious fates, about a pattern of events that suggested someone or something was systematically targeting the infrastructure of human bondage. What he discovered suggested a campaign that had been ongoing for years, dozens of slave traders dead, insane, or mysteriously retired. Hundreds of slaves vanished without trace, a ghost moving through the South, leaving chaos in her wake. And always in the aftermath, reports of a woman in gray, a woman whose description varied, but whose eyes remained constant. Violet blue, seeing everything, judging everything, and finding the guilty wanting. Crawford didn't believe in supernatural explanations. He'd seen too much of human cruelty to think the universe required anything beyond natural evil. But he also couldn't explain what he was observing with purely material reasoning. Something was happening in Richmond, something that centered on the beautiful slave who should never have been brought to auction, and Crawford feared the resolution would be catastrophic. On the 8th day after Josiah's arrival at the Witmore estate, Harrison began showing signs of mental deterioration. He stopped sleeping, claiming he heard voices whenever he closed his eyes, voices speaking in languages he didn't understand, but that filled him with inexplicable dread. He stopped eating, saying food tasted like ash in his mouth. His hands developed a tremor that grew steadily worse until he could barely sign his name. Catherine watched her husband's decline with growing terror. She tried to get Josiah removed from the house, even offered to arrange his sale at a massive loss, but Harrison refused very suggestion. He seemed almost addicted to Josiah's presence, would spend hours sitting in whatever room the slave occupied, just staring at him, occasionally muttering incoherently about beauty and possession and the price of pride. Thomas finally went to Richmond to consult with a doctor who specialized in disorders of the mind. The physician listened to his description of Harrison's symptoms and prescribed laudanum for sleep and bloodletting to balance the humors, but privately he told Thomas something more disturbing. Your brother's condition isn't medical, it's moral. Something is consuming him from the inside. Guilt, perhaps, or a reckoning with truths he spent his life avoiding. I've seen this before in men who've committed great evils and suddenly found themselves unable to maintain the psychological barriers that let them function despite their crimes. The mind turns on itself. It's quite fascinating from a medical perspective, but also quite deadly. Most patients in this state don't survive more than a few weeks. What can I do to help him? Remove whatever triggered the crisis? If it was acquiring this slave, then the slave must go immediately before the condition becomes irreversible. But when Thomas returned to the estate with this advice, he found Harrison sitting in the drawing room with Josiah standing behind his chair, like a beautiful angel of death. And Harrison, in a moment of terrible clarity, looked at his brother and said, "It's too late, Thomas. I understand that now. I destroyed us for something I could never actually possess. You can't own a person. Not really. You can own their labor. You can control their movement. But the essence of them, the thing that makes them human, that remains forever beyond ownership. And trying to possess that essence is what condemns us all." "Harrison, please," Thomas began. "I'm going to die soon," Harrison continued calmly. "I've known it since the auction, since the moment I spoke, that obscene price, $20,000 for a human being, as if any amount of money could justify reducing someone to property. I've been living in sin my entire life, Thomas. We all have. And now the bill has come due. That night, at exactly 3:17 a.m., every slave on the Witmore plantation woke simultaneously from identical nightmares. They dreamed of chains breaking, of auction blocks crumbling to dust, of a woman in gray walking through Virginia, leaving freedom in her wake. And they'd heard a voice impossible to ignore telling them that liberation was coming, that the system that had ground them down for generations was about to fracture, that they needed only to survive a little longer, and they would see slavery itself begin to die. Ruth, the old house slave, went to Thomas's room and woke him. "Something's happening," she said urgently. "All of us felt it. That boy you brought here, he's not alone. There's something with him. Something that's been growing stronger every day he's been in this house, and tonight it's going to act. You need to get your family out now before it's too late." Thomas wanted to dismiss her warning as superstition, but he'd felt it too, a building pressure in the air, a sense of something massive about to break through the thin surface of normal reality. He went to his brother's room and found it empty, found Catherine's room empty as well, and when he went looking for them he discovered all three, Harrison, Catherine, and Josiah, standing in the garden in the pre-dawn darkness. Harrison was on his knees, weeping. Catherine stood rigid, her face streaked with tears, and Josiah stood between them like a priest conducting some terrible ceremony. "He's showing us," Catherine said in a hollow voice when Thomas approached. "Everything we've done, every cruelty, every betrayal, every lie, it's all there. We can see it all, and we can't deny it anymore. We can't pretend. We can't hide. The truth is destroying us, and we deserve it. We deserve every moment of this agony." Thomas grabbed Josiah by the arm, intending to drag him away from his family. But the moment his hand made contact, he felt electricity surge through his body. Not physical electricity, something else, and suddenly he was seeing things, memories that weren't his own. The kidnapped slaves his father had purchased, their terror, their grief, their despair, the families torn apart, the lives destroyed, the endless accumulation of suffering that had built the Witmore fortune, all of it flooding into his consciousness at once, impossible to deny, impossible to dismiss. He released Josiah's arm and staggered backward, gasping. "What are you?" Josiah smiled, that sad smile. "I'm what happens when oppression becomes so vast that reality itself must bend to accommodate justice. I'm the reckoning you've avoided for generations. I'm every suppressed truth demanding to be heard. And I'm just the beginning." The sun rose on a plantation transformed. The slaves had gathered near the main house, not threatening, not aggressive, but present in a way they'd never been before. Present as witnesses to whatever was about to occur. As participants in a shift that none of them fully understood. But all of them felt in their bones something fundamental was changing, something that would ripple far beyond this single estate. And in Richmond, in auction houses and law offices and bank boardrooms, men were beginning to understand that the acquisition of one impossibly beautiful slave had triggered consequences that would consume them all. The news from the Witmore estate reached Richmond by mid-m morning. A rider arrived at James Pulliam's office with a message that made the slave trader blood run cold. Harrison Witmore was dead, found in his study at dawn with no marks of violence, no sign of struggle. He'd simply stopped living. His face held an expression that the messenger described as peaceful acceptance mixed with absolute horror, like a man who'd seen the truth of his entire existence and couldn't survive the knowledge. Catherine Witmore had been taken to her sister's home in Richmond, barely coherent, muttering about revelations and judgment. Thomas had assumed temporary control of the estate, but had sent word that he would be selling everything immediately: the plantation, the slaves, every asset the family owned. He wanted nothing more to do with any of it. And Josiah had vanished sometime between dawn and when the doctor arrived to examine Harrison's body. He'd simply disappeared from the estate. No one saw him leave. The slaves claimed ignorance with expressions that suggested they knew far more than they were saying. But Thomas hadn't pursued the matter. He'd seemed relieved that the beautiful slave was gone. Pull read the message 3 times, his hands shaking. Harry. Son Witmore had paid $20,000 for a slave who destroyed him in 8 days, and now that slave was loose somewhere in Richmond, carrying whatever terrible purpose had killed Gideon Hale and driven Harrison to his death. He needed to warn the other bidders, needed to tell them that Josiah wasn't just valuable property, but something far more dangerous. But even as he considered this, Piam knew it was too late. The forces set in motion by that auction couldn't be stopped by warnings or precautions. Something fundamental had shifted, and Richmond's elite would pay the price for their participation in human bondage. Daniel Preston learned of Harrison's death while preparing documents to declare bankruptcy. Elizabeth's departure had taken with it the capital that kept his family's Richmond operations solvent. Without her money, the Preston holdings couldn't service their debts. Everything would have to be sold. The townhouse on Gray Street, the shares in 3 textile mills, even his father's collection of rare books that represented generations of Preston scholarship. But Daniel found himself unable to care about financial ruin. Something else was consuming him. Ever since the auction, he'd been having dreams, vivid nightmares, where he saw himself from outside his body, saw himself as others must see him, a man who'd been willing to purchase a human being as a gift to plead his abolitionist wife. The moral grotesqueness of that attempt had been invisible to him in the moment, but now he couldn't stop seeing it. Couldn't stop understanding that he'd been willing to compromise every principle to maintain access to money and status. The night after Harrison's death, Daniel woke to find someone standing at the foot of his bed. In the darkness, he could make out only a silhouette, but he knew immediately who it was. "You're here to kill me," Daniel said, surprised by his own calm. Josiah's voice came from the darkness. "I'm not here to kill anyone, Mr. Preston. That's not my purpose. I'm here to show you the truth. What you do with that truth is your choice." Light flared as Josiah lit the bedside lamp. In the warm glow, his beauty was almost painful. Daniel looked at him and felt the full weight of what he tried to do. Attempted to purchase this person, reduce him to property, all to salvage a marriage already destroyed by Daniel's own moral bankruptcy. How did you get in here? The doors are locked. Locks are physical barriers. What I am moves beyond such limitations. I told you at the auction, Mr. Preston. Watch what happens when men try to possess what was never meant to be owned. You're watching now. Your marriage ended. Your fortune vanished. Your father's reputation about to be destroyed when it becomes public knowledge. How you attempted to misuse your wife's trust fund. My father had nothing to do with my decisions. Your father built his political career on maintaining the slavery system. He's voted for every law that strengthened bondage, opposed every measure that might have granted freedom. He's been complicit in the suffering of millions of people, and you followed his path perfectly. Both of you choosing power and comfort over justice. Both of you telling yourselves that politics is just politics, that personal moral responsibility doesn't apply to systemic evil. Daniel felt tears running down his face. I didn't understand. I swear I didn't see. You understood perfectly. You simply chose not to let understanding affect your behavior. That's different. That's worse. Actually, ignorance can be educated, but willful blindness that requires a crisis to break through. And you're in that crisis now, Mr. Preston. The question is whether you'll emerge from it, changed or destroyed. Josiah walked to the window and looked out at Richmond's sleeping streets. This city built its wealth on stolen lives, he said quietly. Every mansion, every cobblestone, every chandelier in every drawing room, all of it funded by human suffering. The enslaved people who were bought and sold here number in the hundreds of thousands over the decades, and each one was a complete human being with hopes and dreams and potential that was crushed to serve other people's greed. He turned back to Daniel. Your wife understood that. She tried to make you understand, but you couldn't hear her because hearing would have required changing, and change was too expensive. Well, the bill has come due anyway. You'll lose everything regardless. The only choice now is whether you lose your soul along with your fortune. After Josiah left, slipping out of the locked room as impossibly as he'd entered, Daniel sat in bed for hours. His mind churned through memories. Every slave auction he'd attended, every human being he'd casually owned, every time he justified the system because dismantling it would be inconvenient. The weight of it crushed down on him like physical pressure, and he understood exactly why Harrison Witmore had died. The truth, fully faced, was unbearable. But Daniel chose differently than Harrison. At dawn, he began writing letters to his father explaining that he would no longer represent the family's interests in Richmond, that he was withdrawing from Virginia society entirely, to his wife, acknowledging everything he'd done wrong and asking not for forgiveness, but simply for her to know he finally understood. And to the newspapers, a detailed confession of his attempted misuse of Elizabeth's trust fund and his participation in the slavery system that he now recognized as evil beyond rationalization. The letters were published 2 days later, creating a scandal that consumed Richmond society. A Preston publicly denouncing slavery was unthinkable. The family's reputation shattered overnight. Senator Marcus Preston suffered a stroke upon reading his son's confession and would never fully recover. The political career he'd built over 3 decades ended in disgrace. But Daniel felt something like peace for the first time in years. He'd lost everything, but in losing everything, he'd found the beginnings of a conscience that wasn't compromised by self-interest. Meanwhile, Thomas Crawford was piecing together information that suggested a pattern far larger than anyone had realized. He'd tracked down records of slave trader deaths across 5 states over 7 years, each death preceded by reports of a mysterious woman, each death leaving behind freed slaves and destroyed business operations, and in 3 cases, reports of a young person matching Josiah's description appearing briefly before vanishing again. Crawford found a former slave trader in Petersburg who'd survived an encounter with the woman in gray. The man named Hoskins had retired from the trade 5 years earlier, and now ran a modest dry goods store. He refused to discuss what happened for years, but Crawford's persistence finally broke through his silence. She came to me at night, Hoskins said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was sleeping in a warehouse full of slaves. I just purchased, planning to take them to market in Norfolk the next day. I woke to find her standing over me. Gray dress, gray hair, but those eyes, Lord, those eyes, like looking into every sin you've ever committed, reflected back at you. Crawford leaned forward. What did she do to you? She touched my forehead with one finger. Just one touch, and I saw everything. Every slave I'd ever bought or sold, every family I'd separated, every person who died because of my actions. I saw a mother throwing herself off a ship in the Middle Passage after I'd purchased her in Charleston. I saw a man hang himself in a barn after I'd sold his wife to a different owner. I saw children beaten and starved and worked to death on plantations where I delivered them. All of it. Years and years of suffering, and I was responsible for every moment. Hoskins was crying now, tears running down his weathered face. I begged her to kill me, told her I couldn't live with what I'd seen, but she said death was too easy. She said I had to live with the knowledge, had to carry it every day, had to let it change me or let it destroy me. Those were my choices. And the slaves in your warehouse gone when I woke the next morning. Every chain unlocked, every door open. They vanished like they'd never existed, and I never traded in human flesh again. I couldn't. Every time I even thought about it, I'd see those visions, feel that weight. I moved here, started over, tried to live a life that wasn't built on suffering. Crawford asked the question that had been haunting him. The young man with violet eyes, was he with her? Hoskins nodded slowly. He appeared twice. Once in South Carolina when she freed a group of slaves from a holding facility. Once in Georgia when a trader named Morton had an accident that left him paralyzed. Different ages in each sighting, like he was growing up across these years. But the same presence, the same purpose, which is what? What's their purpose? Justice, Hoskins said simply. Not revenge, not random violence. Justice. They target the infrastructure of slavery, the traders, the auction houses, the financial systems that profit from human bondage. They're dismantling it piece by piece, and they're using truth as their weapon, making people see what they've been part of, what they've supported, what they've ignored. Crawford left Petersburg with more questions than answers. If what Hoskins described was accurate, then Josiah and the woman in gray represented something unprecedented, a force moving through the South, specifically targeting slavery's mechanisms. But why Richmond? Why the elaborate auction? Why allow himself to be sold to Harrison Witmore, only to kill the man days later? The answer came to Crawford in a flash of understanding. Richmond wasn't the target. The auction wasn't about Josiah being sold. It was about gathering Richmond's elite in one room, about making them compete for him, about getting them to reveal the depths of their depravity through their bidding. The auction was a trap designed to expose who would pay the most to own another human being, and everyone who participated had been marked. Crawford began tracking the other bidders. Mrs. Ashford, the widow who bid $9,000. She'd suffered a house fire that destroyed half her mansion but killed no one. The fire had started in her study where she kept documentation of illegal slave purchases dating back decades. All of it consumed, her wealth largely destroyed, but she survived. Williams, the cotton factor who'd seen Josiah as an investment opportunity. He'd been ruined by a series of mysterious business failures, ships sinking, warehouses flooding, contracts canceling for no apparent reason. Within 2 weeks of the auction, he'd gone from wealthy to bankrupt, and the quiet man, Graves, who Crawford now knew had been speaking the truth at the auction, sold to death and misery. Graves had been warning them, had understood what they were too blind to see. Crawford needed to find Josiah, not to capture him, but to understand the full scope of what was happening. Because if this pattern continued, if every person complicit in slavery became a target for these impossible reckonings, then the entire South was about to experience a crisis that would make political tensions look trivial by comparison. He found Josiah in the last place he expected, at the African church on Broad Street, sitting in a back pew during evening services. Crawford slipped into the pew beside him, and Josiah turned to him with those unsettling violet eyes. "Mr. Crawford, I wondered when you'd find me. I need to understand what's happening here, what you are, what your purpose is. I'm a catalyst, an instrument of truth. The woman you've been investigating, she's been working for years to undermine slavery from within, freeing individuals, destroying Durs. But she understood that individual actions weren't enough. The system is too vast, too entrenched. So she needed something bigger, a demonstration that would shake the foundations of slaveholder society. The auction. Bring together the wealthiest, most powerful men in Richmond. Make them compete to own someone. Let them reveal their true nature through their bids and then show them what they really are. Hold a mirror up to their souls and force them to see the monsters reflected back. Some, like Harrison Witmore, can't survive that revelation. Others, like Daniel Preston, might find redemption. But all of them are changed, and change ripples outward. You're trying to end slavery through individual conversions. Josiah shook his head. I'm trying to plant seeds of doubt to crack the certainty that lets good people participate in evil systems. Slavery won't end because of what I do. It will end because of economic forces and political movements and eventually war. But when those forces arrive, will this region be ready? Will the people here be capable of imagining a different world? That depends on whether enough of them have been forced to see the truth of what they've been part of. Crawford was silent for a long moment. Then he said, People are going to come looking for you. Dangerous people. People who understand you're a threat to their entire way of life. Let them come. The more they react, the more they reveal. Every act of violence against me proves my point about the system they're defending. Every attempt to recapture me demonstrates the cruelty they're willing to employ. I'm not afraid of them, Mr. Crawford. They should be afraid of the truth. Tonight, 5 of Richmond's leading citizens met in secret at the home of Charles Pembroke, a judge who'd presided over numerous cases enforcing fugitive slave laws. They'd all heard about Harrison Witmore's death. All understood that something unprecedented was happening, and all recognized that Josiah represented an existential threat to their social order. We need to eliminate him, Pembroke said bluntly. I don't care how we do it, but that slave cannot remain at large. He's destabilizing everything. He's not a normal runaway, another man replied. Samuel Torrance, owner of Richmond's largest slave auction house. He's organized, somehow connected to something bigger. The woman in gray that people keep mentioning. There's a network here, an abolitionist conspiracy operating right under our noses. Then we root it out. We use every resource at our disposal. We make it clear that anyone harboring this fugitive will face consequences. We hire the best slave catchers money can buy, and we make an example that will discourage any other slaves from thinking they can defy the system. They drafted a formal notice, $5,000 reward for Josiah's capture, permission granted for extreme measures in his recovery, public warning that anyone assisting him would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The notice would be printed in every Richmond newspaper and distributed throughout Virginia. But as they signed the document, none of them noticed the small crack that had appeared in Pembroke's study window. None of them saw the figure in gray standing in the garden outside, watching them plan violence against her son. None of them understood that their conspiracy had been observed from the beginning, and that their plans were already accounted for in a design far more sophisticated than they could imagine. The woman in gray smiled in the darkness. Let them hunt. Let them offer rewards. Let them prove through their desperation exactly what they were willing to do to maintain power over other human beings. Every action they took would serve her purpose. Every act of violence would demonstrate the brutality of the system they defended. The trap had been set months ago. The auction had been the bait, and now Richmond's elite were walking exactly where she needed them to go, toward revelation, toward judgment, toward a reckoning they couldn't avoid. The education Graves had mentioned at the auction was entering its final phase, and the lesson would be written in the destruction of everyone who'd thought they could possess Josiah without consequence. The beautiful slave they'd competed to own was actually the instrument of their destruction, and by the time they understood that truth, it would be far too late to save themselves. The manhunt for Josiah began at dawn on August 27th, 11 days after the auction that had set Richmond on fire. Professional slave catchers arrived from as far as Georgia and Tennessee, drawn by the unprecedented $5,000 reward. They brought dogs trained to track runaways, brought chains and restraints designed for the most resistant captives, brought a willingness to employ violence that exceeded even the normal brutality of their profession. But they found nothing. Josiah had vanished into Richmond's hidden geography, the spaces between official recognition and actual reality. The network of free black people, sympathetic whites, and enslaved people who maintained secret channels of communication and protection. He moved through the city like smoke, visible for moments before dispersing, always one step ahead of his pursuers. The slave catchers grew increasingly frustrated and increasingly violent. They raided homes in the black sections of Richmond, destroying property and terrorizing families on the flimsiest suspicions. They dragged free black people off the streets, demanding to see their papers, beating those whose documentation wasn't immediately available. The violence they employed in searching for Josiah revealed the cruelty that had always been present in the system, but usually remained hidden behind legal formalities. And that revelation was exactly the point. Thomas Crawford understood this as he watched the manhunt devolve into naked terrorism. Josiah wasn't hiding because he feared capture. He was hiding to draw out the violence, to make the slave catchers and their sponsors reveal their true nature to anyone paying attention. Every brutal raid, every innocent person beaten, every family terrorized, all of it proved what abolitionists had been saying for decades, that slavery wasn't a benign institution of economic necessity, but a system of violence that required constant terror to maintain itself. The woman in gray watched this unfold from her various vantage points throughout Richmond. She'd established herself weeks ago under a false identity as Mrs. Eleanor Graves, a widow from Baltimore seeking property investments. She attended social functions, observed the elite families, listened to their conversations, and she documented everything with a precision that would have impressed the most dedicated historian. In her rented rooms, she maintained extensive files on Richmond's leading citizens, their business dealings, their personal scandals, their involvement in the slavery system. She'd been compiling this information for months, preparing for the moment when it would be deployed with maximum effect. The auction had been phase 1, gathering the targets and making them reveal their willingness to pay obscene amounts for human property. The manhunt was phase 2, making them reveal the violence they would employ to recapture that property. Phase 3 was about to begin, and it would shatter Richmond's social order completely. Catherine Witmore had been staying with her sister since Harrison's death, barely speaking, barely eating, her mind circling endlessly around the revelations Josiah had forced upon her, the affairs she'd been conducting, the pregnancy she'd been hiding, the knowledge that the child she was carrying wasn't her husband's. The secrets that had seemed so important before now felt trivial compared to the larger truth Josiah had shown her. The entire edifice of her life had been built on lies. Her marriage, her social position, her family's wealth, all of it constructed from the suffering of enslaved people her family had purchased, exploited, and discarded without thought. She began writing not a diary or letters, but a confession. Everything she knew about her family's involvement in slavery, the kidnapped free black people her father-in-law had purchased, the falsified documentation, the bribes paid to judges and officials, the systematic cruelty employed to maintain control over human property. She wrote it all down with the clarity of someone who'd been forced to see truth and could no longer unsee it. When her sister discovered what Catherine was writing, she was horrified. "You can't publish this. You'll destroy what's left of our family's reputation." "Our reputation deserves to be destroyed," Catherine replied calmly. "Everything we are is built on bones. I won't protect that anymore. I won't pretend anymore. If my confession ruins us, then we should be ruined." She sent the document to 3 Richmond newspapers, to abolitionist publications in the North, and to federal authorities in Washington. The confession would reach its various destinations over the following weeks, and when it did, the Witmore family's crimes would become public knowledge. Other families would face scrutiny. Questions would be asked about how many other respectable households had built their fortunes on illegal trafficking of free black people. The same pattern was repeating across Richmond. Daniel Preston's confession had inspired others. Men and women who'd participated in the slavery system and who'd been living with suppressed guilt found themselves unable to maintain the psychological barriers that had allowed them to function. They began speaking out, writing confessions, abandoning the system they'd once supported. Not everyone, of course. Many of Richmond's elite doubled down on their support for slavery, became more vocal in their defense of it, more aggressive in their attacks on abolitionists. But the cracks in their certainty were showing. The confidence that had once characterized slaveholder society was fracturing. Judge Pembroke led the resistance against what he called the moral hysteria spreading through Richmond. He gave speeches defending slavery as divinely ordained and economically necessary. He published editorials attacking those who'd begun to question the system, and he used his judicial authority to prosecute anyone he suspected of harboring Josiah or assisting his escape. But Pembroke's aggression only made him a more visible target. Thomas Crawford began investigating the judge's history and discovered connections to some of the worst abuse of the slavery system. Pembroke had presided over cases where free black people had been declared slaves based on the flimsiest evidence. He'd enforced fugitive slave laws with a cruelty that exceeded legal requirements. He'd financially profited from his position through bribes and kickbacks from slave traders. Crawford compiled this information and passed it to Mrs. Eleanor Graves, who added it to her growing documentation of Richmond's corruption. The trap was closing around Pembroke and the others who tried to organize the manhunt. On September 3rd, exactly 18 days after the auction, Josiah appeared publicly for the first time since Harrison Witmore's death. He walked into Judge Pembroke's courtroom during a trial where a captured runaway slave was being prosecuted. Josiah sat in the gallery among the spectators and simply watched the proceedings with those violent eyes that seemed to strip away all pretense. The slave on trial, a woman named Sarah, who'd escaped from a plantation outside Richmond, stood silently as Pembroke prepared to render judgment. The evidence against her was overwhelming. She'd been caught 10 miles outside the city, clearly attempting to reach the north. The penalty for her escape would be public whipping and sale to a buyer in the deep south, where escape would be nearly impossible. Pembroke was delivering his sentence when he looked up and saw Josiah sitting in the gallery. The judge stopped mid-sentence. His face went pale. His hands began to shake. Every person in the courtroom turned to look at what had caught his attention, and saw the beautiful young man, who'd become the object of an obsessive manhunt. The slave catchers who'd been Ned at the courthouse rushed toward Josiah, but he stood calmly and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. "Judge Pembroke, would you like to tell everyone here about the 14 free black people you've declared slaves over the past 5 years? About the bribes you've accepted from slave traders? About your financial stake in the auction house that profits from human trafficking?" Pembroke's face turned from pale to red. Guards seized that fugitive immediately, but before anyone could reach him, Josiah continued, "Or should we discuss what happened to the Thompson family? How you ruled them slaves despite documentation proving their freedom? How they were sold south and you received $200 for facilitating the transaction?" The gallery erupted in murmurs. Josiah's accusations were specific enough to ring true. People began looking at Pembroke with new suspicion. The judge's authority, built on decades of apparently impartial service, cracked under the weight of these revelations. "He's lying," Pembroke shouted. "He's a fugitive slave making desperate accusations." "Then examine your records," Josiah said calmly. "Check the cases I've mentioned. You'll find the irregularities. You'll see the pattern. Unless you've destroyed the evidence, which would itself be telling, wouldn't it?" The slave catchers reached Josiah, but as they grabbed his arms, something extraordinary happened. The woman in gray appeared at the courtroom door, not entering, just standing at the threshold, and when she raised one hand, every chain in the courtroom shattered simultaneously. The manacles on Sarah, the restraints on 2 other slaves being held for trial, even the decorative chain that held a chandelier crashed to the floor in a cascade of broken links. The courtroom dissolved into chaos. People screamed and fled. The slave catchers released Josiah and backed away, suddenly terrified of forces they couldn't understand. And in the confusion, Josiah, Sarah, and the other freed slaves walked out of the courtroom with the woman in gray, disappearing into Richmond's streets, while behind them, Judge Pembroke collapsed behind his bench, clutching his chest. His authority shattered beyond repair. Thomas Crawford witnessed the entire incident from the gallery. He'd been tracking Josiah and had anticipated he might appear at Pembroke's court, but what he'd seen exceeded any natural explanation. Chains didn't simply break simultaneously. That required either coordination beyond anything he'd witnessed, or something that transcended normal physical laws. He followed the group at a distance as they moved through Richmond's streets. They didn't run or hide. They walked openly and somehow no one stopped them. It was as if people simply didn't see them or saw them, but couldn't quite process what they were witnessing. Crawford recognized this as the same quality Josiah had possessed since the auction, the ability to be present yet somehow outside normal perception. They led him to a warehouse near the James River. Crawford waited outside for several minutes before deciding to enter. Inside he found not just Josiah and the woman in gray, but dozens of other people, freed slaves from various estates, free black people who'd been helping with the underground network, and several white Richmonders who'd secretly opposed slavery despite the social costs. The woman in gray stood at the center of this group, and when Crawford entered, she turned to him with eyes that held the same violet-blue color as Josiah's mother and son. Clearly the family resemblance went beyond eye color to something deeper, a shared quality of seeing beyond surface reality to the mechanisms beneath. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice gentle, but carrying absolute authority, "I'm glad you found us. We've been hoping you would." "Who are you really?" Crawford asked. "What are you?" "I'm exactly what I appear to be, a woman who lost her son to slavery and spent 7 years getting him back. But I'm also something more, a catalyst for change, an instrument of truth. Call me Eleanor. That's the name I've chosen for this work. The things I've seen, the chains breaking, Josiah's ability to move through the city unseen. That's not natural." Eleanor smiled. "Isn't it? Chains have always been psychological as much as physical, Mr. Crawford. What you saw today was simply the physical manifestation of a truth that's always existed. Slavery is built on illusions. The illusion that some people can own others, the illusion that bondage is natural and permanent, the illusion that the system can't be challenged. Break those illusions, and the physical chains break as well." Crawford wanted to dismiss this as mystical nonsense, but he'd seen too much to maintain comfortable rationality. "What happens now? Pembroke will rally every resource against you. Richmond's elite won't forgive what you've done. They'll try to strike back," Eleanor agreed. "That's expected, necessary even, because every act of violence they commit proves our point about the system they're defending. Every persecution demonstrates the cruelty required to maintain slavery. They can't win, Mr. Crawford. They can only reveal themselves." Over the next 2 weeks, Richmond experienced what later historians would call the September Crisis. Though contemporary accounts would be heavily censored and manipulated, a wave of slave escapes unlike anything seen before. Dozens of enslaved people simply walking away from their owners, moving through the city in broad daylight, somehow evading capture despite the massive manhunt efforts. Simultaneously, documents began appearing throughout Richmond, posted on walls, left on church steps, distributed through mysterious channels. These documents detailed the criminal activities of prominent citizens, the illegal slave trafficking, the bribery and corruption, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women, the systematic violence, all of it documented with names, dates, and specific incidents that couldn't be easily dismissed. Eleanor's files, built over months of careful investigation, were being deployed strategically, each revelation carefully timed to maximize impact, each exposure designed to crack the unified front of Richmond's slaveholding class. Some of the exposed men fled the city, others doubled down on their defenses, but found themselves increasingly isolated as former allies distanced themselves from the scandals. The economic impact was catastrophic. Slave prices plummeted as buyers became afraid of purchasing property that might simply walk away. Auction houses lost business. Traders found themselves unable to operate. The entire infrastructure of Virginia's slave economy trembled as confidence in the system's stability evaporated. And through it all, Josiah moved through Richmond like a ghost, appearing at crucial moments to deliver specific revelations to specific people. He visited the homes of slaveholders and showed them truths about themselves they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. Some, like Harrison Witmore, couldn't survive these revelations. Others found themselves transformed, abandoning the system they'd once supported. If you're intrigued by stories of resistance and hidden history, by narratives that reveal uncomfortable truths about the past, you'll find more buried stories like this here on The Sealed Room. We specialize in the histories that powerful institutions tried to erase. Subscribe and join us in bringing these suppressed truths back to light. On September 17th, exactly 1 month after the auction, Eleanor orchestrated her final demonstration. She arranged for every piece of documentation she'd compiled to be delivered simultaneously to newspapers across Virginia and the North. to federal authorities, and to abolitionist organizations. Hundreds of pages detailing Richmond's involvement in illegal slave trading, corruption, and systematic violence. The revelations sent shockwaves through Virginia and beyond. Federal investigations were launched, lawsuits were filed. Several prominent Richmond citizens fled to avoid prosecution. The social order that had seemed so permanent and unshakable was revealed as fragile construction built on crimes that could no longer be hidden. Judge Pembroke was among those who fled, disappearing into the Deep South where his crimes would be less scrutinized. His judicial career was destroyed, his reputation obliterated. The other men who'd organized the manhunt for Josiah CED similar fates: bankruptcy, exposure, social exile. The slave catchers who terrorized Richmond's black community found themselves targets of investigation for their brutal methods. Several were prosecuted, others left Virginia entirely, their profession suddenly far more dangerous than it had been before. Thomas Crawford found Eleanor one final time before she and Josiah departed Richmond for good. They met in the warehouse where he'd first found her network, now mostly empty as the people she'd helped escape moved on to their next destinations. "You've destroyed Richmond's slave trade," Crawford said, "at least temporarily. But the system is too big. It will rebuild." "Of course it will," Eleanor agreed. "This was never about ending slavery through our actions alone. It was about planting seeds, creating doubt, demonstrating that the system isn't as invulnerable as its defenders claim. When the real crisis comes, and it will come soon, the political crisis that will tear this nation apart, will Virginia be ready? Will the South be capable of imagining a different future? That depends on how many people have been forced to see the truth. Was it worth it? The risk, the violence, the people who died." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Harrison Witmore died confronting the truth of what he'd done. That's more mercy than he gave the people he enslaved. The others who've been exposed, who've lost their fortunes and reputations, they're experiencing a fraction of the suffering they inflicted on others. So yes, Mr. Crawford, it was worth it. Every moment of it." Josiah approached them, and Crawford saw in his face not the mysterious beauty that had captivated Richmond's elite, but something simpler and more human. A young man who'd survived something terrible and come out the other side still fighting. "What will you do now?" Crawford asked him. "Continue the work. There are other cities, other networks, other institutions that profit from bondage. My mother and we've learned how to crack them, how to use their own greed and pride against them. We'll keep moving, keep revealing, keep breaking the chains, both physical and psychological." "And you?" Eleanor asked Crawford. "What will you do with what you've learned?" Crawford thought about his past as a slave catcher, about the lives he destroyed in pursuit of profit, about the woman with violet eyes in South Carolina who'd changed his path 5 years ago. "I'll help whatever this network needs, whatever resources I can provide. I owe a debt I can never fully repay." Eleanor nodded, acceptance. "Then the work continues for all of us." They departed Richmond separately over the following days, Eleanor and Josiah heading north, then west, their trail deliberately obscured. The freed slaves they'd helped scattering to various destinations, the white allies returning to their normal lives, carrying with them knowledge that would inform their future actions. Thomas Crawford stayed in Richmond, documenting everything that had happened. He compiled his observations into a manuscript he titled The Richmond Horror: How Beauty Became Justice. The manuscript would never be published during his lifetime. Too controversial, too dangerous. It would remain hidden in Crawford's effects until after his death in 1873, when his daughter would discover it and recognize its historical importance. By that time, the Civil War had come and gone. Slavery had been abolished through constitutional amendment. The system that had seemed so permanent in 1855 had been destroyed by forces far larger than Eleanor and Josiah's operations. But Crawford's manuscript argued that their work had been essential preparation, that the cracks they'd created in slaveholder certainty had made the eventual collapse possible. That truth had been a weapon as powerful as any army. The manuscript also addressed questions that haunted everyone who'd witnessed the events. What exactly were Eleanor and Josiah? Were they simply determined activists using psychological manipulation and clever timing? Or had they been something more? Something that transcended normal human categories? Crawford's conclusion was characteristically pragmatic. It doesn't matter what they were. What matters is what they did. They forced people to see truth. They demonstrated that slavery's apparent permanence was illusion. They proved that resistance was possible, even when resistance seemed futile. Whether they accomplished this through natural means or supernatural intervention is ultimately irrelevant. The effect was the same. Change became possible because someone refused to accept the existing order as inevitable. The beautiful slave who sold for $20,000 in Richmond in August 1855 vanished from official historical records after September. No documentation exists of Josiah's later life. No records track Eleanor's movements after she left Virginia. Some historians have suggested they were myths, legends created to give hope to enslaved people during desperate times. But Thomas Crawford's manuscript insists they were real, and more importantly, it argues they weren't unique. That throughout the South, individuals and networks were working to undermine slavery from within. That the system's collapse wasn't simply the result of Northern armies and political movements, but also of internal rot exposed by people willing to risk everything to reveal truth. The auction in Richmond became legend in different ways for different audiences. Among Virginia's white elite, it was remembered as a cautionary tale about obsession and excess, about the dangers of paying too much for anything, even human property. The story was sanitized, made safe, turned into a narrative about financial imprudence rather than moral reckoning. But among the black community, the story survived in different form, as a tale of resistance and justice, of a beautiful young man who walked into the heart of slavery's infrastructure and destroyed it from within, of chains that broke not just physically, but spiritually, of truth that proved more powerful than any violence slavery could employ. Both versions contain elements of truth. Both miss parts of the larger reality. What really happened in Richmond in August and September 1855 was something that couldn't be neatly categorized or easily explained. It was a moment when the assumed order cracked, when people who'd thought themselves secure discovered their security was illusion, when a system that claimed moral legitimacy revealed its foundation in violence and corruption. The incredible mystery of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in Richmond isn't ultimately about beauty, or monetary value, or the specific mechanics of one auction. It's about something more fundamental. It's about the price of moral complicity, the cost of participating in evil systems, the reckoning that comes inevitably for those who value profit and status over human dignity. Every person who bid on Josiah revealed something about themselves through their bidding. Every person who participated in his manhunt demonstrated the violence they were willing to employ to maintain control over other human beings. And every person who faced the truth he forced upon them had to make a choice: change or be destroyed, adapt or cling to dying certainties. Richmond survived the September crisis, but it was changed. The confidence that had characterized Virginia's slaveholding class was permanently damaged. Questions that had been unthinkable became speakable. Doubts that had been suppressed found expression. The city limped toward civil war 5 years later, already fractured by internal contradictions that Eleanor and Josiah had helped expose. And somewhere in the north, a beautiful young man with violet eyes and his determined mother continued their work, moving through cities, identifying targets, using truth as their weapon, breaking chains wherever they found them, creating cracks in slavery's foundation that would widen until the entire edifice collapsed. That's the real mystery. Not how one slave sold for an impossible price, but how resistance persisted even in the darkest times. How hope survived when hope seemed irrational. How people trapped in an evil system found ways to fight back even when fighting seemed futile. The story of Josiah and Eleanor reminds us that history isn't just something that happens to people, it's something people make through their choices. That systems of oppression, no matter how powerful they appear, contain within them the seeds of their own destruction. That truth, once revealed, can never be fully suppressed again. Richmond tried to forget what happened in 1855, tried to erase the records, tried to pretend the September crisis had never occurred, but history remembers. The suppressed documents survive in archives. The stories persist in family histories. The truth endures despite all efforts to bury it. What do you think drove men to bid such impossible sums for another human being? What does it reveal about the psychology of slavery that beauty could command higher prices than strength or skill? How does the story of Josiah's resistance change your understanding of the Antebellum South? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone, and these conversations help us understand which buried histories matter most to our community. If this story affected you, if it made you think differently about history and resistance and the power of truth, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. These stories are too important to remain sealed away. Subscribe to make sure you never miss our deep investigations into the histories that powerful institutions try to erase. Hit that notification bell because we're just getting started, uncovering the uncomfortable truths that explain how we got here. And remember, history isn't just about understanding the past. It's about recognizing patterns that continue into the present, the same dynamics that allowed slavery to flourish, the willingness to value profit over human dignity, the ability to participate in systemic evil while maintaining personal innocence. Those dynamics still exist, still shape our world, still demand reckoning. The beautiful slave who destroyed Richmond's elite in 1855 teaches us that resistance is always possible, that truth is always powerful, that systems of oppression, no matter how entrenched, can be challenged by people willing to risk everything for justice. That's a lesson every generation needs to learn, and it's why we keep digging into these buried histories, keep revealing these suppressed truths, keep breaking the sealed rooms where uncomfortable stories have been locked away. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, keep refusing to let the past stay buried. We will never know the end of Eleanor and Josiah's story. No census records, no letters, no gravestones mark the rest of their lives. Some say they went to Kansas to fight with abolitionists in the border wars. Some say they settled in Canada, opening a school for people who had escaped bondage. Some say they never stopped moving, never stopped showing up in auction houses and courtrooms and plantation parlors, wherever people needed to be reminded that chains are always, first and foremost, illusions. Richmond did everything it could to erase them. Newspapers pulled old editions. Court records were lost in a courthouse fire. The story of the $20,000 slave was softened into a trivial anecdote about rich men's foolishness, stripped of its teeth, stripped of its truth. But erasure is an admission of power. You do not waste decades trying to bury something that does not scare you. This story has survived for 170 years, not because it is a ghost story, not because it is a tale of magic. It has survived because it is true at the bone. It is true that the most dangerous thing in the world to an oppressive system is a person who cannot be frightened, who cannot be bought, who will not pretend that cruelty is normal or that ownership is justice. It is true that the men who stood on that auction block bidding for Josiah were never buying him. They were bidding to buy their own innocence. They were paying to make the truth go away, to prove that they could own even beauty, even dignity, even a soul. And they learned, one by one, what every generation of oppressors eventually learns: the thing you are trying to own is actually the thing that will own you. Josiah did not curse anyone. He did not cast spells. He simply let men see themselves. He let them pay the price they had already owed for their whole lives. Today, we still live in a world that tries to put price tags on people, that admires the power to own more than it admires the courage to set free, that still tries to bury the truths that make the comfortable uncomfortable. But the lesson of Richmond 1855 has never gone away. No amount of money, no amount of power, no amount of violence will ever let you own what was never meant to be yours. The truth always comes out, the bill always comes due, and the people you thought were the most powerless, they are the ones who will write your legacy. Thank you for sitting with this story. If it stayed with you, carry it, tell it. Truth is the only chain that can never be broken. Until next time.